My own board of directors fired me on a Thursday afternoon in a room I paid for from a company I built, and the vote was 7-1, and the one was me. And the man who moved the motion was Russ Feldman, who had been with me since we were two guys with a rented centrifuge and a second mortgage, who was godfather to my daughter, and who could not look at me while he said the words. 22 years. 7-1. And they did it, all of them, for one reason which everybody in that room understood and nobody said out loud until the very end. Because a client told them to. A client had called my chairman and said, in effect, Gene Tarrant is a problem and problems get solved, and my board of directors looked at the man who founded the company and looked at the client who was 60% of the revenue, and they decided in about 40 minutes which one of us they could live without. Stay with me, because I want to tell you what I did when they told me. I did not argue. I did not threaten. I did not tell them what I was holding, and I was holding something. I had been holding it for 22 years without ever once thinking of it as a weapon. And not one of those 7 people had ever bothered to understand it. I stood up and I shook Russ Feldman's hand, because his hand was out and I am not going to be the man who leaves a hand hanging, and I said, all right, and I walked out to my car, and I sat there for a minute, and then I laughed, out loud, alone in a parking lot, because I had just realized what they had actually done. They had not fired an inconvenient old founder. They had just, by a vote of 7-1 in about 40 minutes without a single one of them checking, torn the license off the front of their own building. My name is Gene Tarrant. I built a testing laboratory, and I want to tell you the whole of this because I think that what happened to my company is happening right now in some form in about half the companies in this country, and almost nobody sees it while it's happening, and it goes like this. You get one customer who is too big, and the moment that customer is bigger than your nerve, you do not have a company anymore. You have a subsidiary that hasn't been told yet. Everything after that is just theater. The board meetings, the strategy sessions, the independence you talk about in your marketing, all of it is theater. And the only real question is what you do on the day the too big customer finally asks you for the one thing you are not supposed to give. Because they always ask. Sooner or later, they always ask. And on that day, you find out whether you built a business or just a very elaborate way of saying yes. Let me tell you what we sold, because you cannot understand any of this if you think we sold data. Tarrant Analytical was an independent testing laboratory. What that means in plain English is that when somebody builds something big, a bridge, a tunnel, a stretch of highway, a public building, somebody has to check the materials. Somebody takes the samples and runs the tests and issues a certified report that says these materials meet the specification, or they don't. And that report is not a document. That report is the whole reason the modern world stands up. Because everybody in that chain has a reason to want a yes. The contractor wants a yes because a no costs him 3 weeks and $4 million. The developer wants a yes. The subcontractor wants a yes. Everybody in the entire chain of money, every single person, is pulling in one direction, and the only thing standing in the other direction is one laboratory with no dog in the fight, whose entire and only value is that its no cannot be bought. That is what we sold. I used to say it to every new hire on their first day, for 22 years, and my people used to make fun of me for it, and they still say it now, and it goes, nobody in this world pays us for our yes. Anybody can print a yes. They pay us for the fact that when we say yes, it means something, and it only means something because we are the kind of people who will say no. That was the product. Not the machines, not the methods, not the building. The no. That was the entire company. Now let me tell you why I built it, because it is not an abstraction to me, and it explains everything I did later, including the part where I lost. I was 24 years old and a junior engineer on a job, a big one, and there was a temporary structure, a work platform, and there was a question about it. And there was a report. And the report said it was fine, and it was signed by a laboratory, a real laboratory with a real name, and I remember exactly nothing about the technical dispute except that I was 24 and had a bad feeling and said so once quietly to a man 20 years older than me who told me the paper was signed and to get back to work. And then it wasn't fine. I am not going to describe it. It is not mine to describe, and there are people still alive who lost somebody that day, and they do not need an old man narrating it on the internet. I will tell you this much. One man died. His name was Hector Ruiz. He was 31. He had 2 kids, and I did not know him. I had spoken to him maybe 4 times, and I have thought about him every working day for 37 years, and I know exactly what his signature looked like because I still have a copy of a sign-in sheet from that morning with his name on it in my desk. And here is what came out afterward, and it is the reason for everything else in my life. The laboratory that signed that report had not been paid to lie. Nobody had bribed anybody. Nothing so clean. What had happened was so much smaller and so much worse. That laboratory got 90% of its work from that one contractor. And so when the question came up, nobody had to be corrupt. The lab just found a way to be comfortable. They rescoped. They used a different standard, which was a defensible standard, which was arguably the correct standard, and everybody involved could tell you with a straight face and a clear conscience exactly why it was reasonable, and the paper got signed, and a man died, and not one single person in that chain ever thought of themselves as having done anything wrong. Ever. Some of them are still working. I want to tell you the part of 1988 that actually matters, though, because the collapse is not the part that made me. The part that made me happened 4 months later in a hallway. There was an inquiry, of course. And I was nobody. I was a 24-year-old junior engineer, but I had said the thing once, quietly, to a man 20 years older than me, and that man remembered it, and so I got asked. And I sat in a room and I told the truth as best I understood it, which was not very well, and then I came out, and in the hallway was the man who had signed the report. He was about 60. Gray suit. He had been signing certified reports for 30 years, and he was, by every account, including mine, a competent and honest engineer. And he was standing in that hallway waiting to go in, and he looked at me and he knew exactly who I was, and he said one thing. He said, "You'll understand when you have a building to keep open." And then he went in. That's it. That's the whole thing. That is the most frightening sentence I have ever heard in my life, and I have carried it for 37 years. Because he was not defending himself. He was not angry at me. He was, I swear to you, being kind. He was giving a young man a piece of advice that he sincerely believed was true and wise and that he had earned the hard way. That one day I would be responsible for people, for salaries, for a building full of families, and on that day I would understand why a reasonable man softens a paragraph. He was not a monster. He was me 30 years later if I got it wrong. He was Russ. He was every good man sitting around a table on a Thursday afternoon in April, and I have spent my whole professional life trying to build a company where that sentence is not true, where the building does not have to be kept open at that price, where a man can afford to say the thing he saw. And I want to be honest with you right here at the front of this story, before I tell you a single flattering thing about myself. He was almost right about me. That sentence almost came true in my own life in 2019, when I had a building full of families and a client with an enormous number, and I broke my own rule to keep the building open. The difference between me and that man in the hallway is not character. It is that I got tested 11 days after I lost the ability to pretend, and he got tested at 60 with a mortgage and a partnership and 30 years of habit. That is the entire difference. That and a sign-in sheet in a drawer. That is the thing I learned at 24, and it is the thesis of my entire life. It does not require a villain. Nobody has to be evil. All it requires is one customer who is too big, and everybody in the building doing the reasonable, understandable, career-preserving thing one small reasonable step at a time until a man falls. So I built a lab. And I built it around one idea, one rule, which I wrote down in 2002 in a notebook I still have. No client is ever more than 20% of revenue. That's it. That was the whole strategy. Not a mission statement, not values on a wall, a number. Because I had learned that integrity is not a personality trait, it is a balance sheet condition. You are exactly as honest as you can afford to be. Every man who signed a bad report was a decent guy who could not afford his own no. And I decided at 24 that I would build a place where the no was always affordable, and I would enforce it with a number because numbers do not care how nice the client is. I held that line for 18 years. 18 years. And I want you to understand that it cost me constantly. There were years where I turned away work, good work, clean work, work my people wanted to do, because taking it would have pushed a client over 20 and I would not do it. Russ used to fight me about it. He'd say, "Gene, we're turning down money to protect ourselves from a hypothetical." And I'd say, "Russ, it's not hypothetical. I've got the sign-in sheet in my drawer." And he'd let it go because he's a decent man, and because for 18 years he did believe it. I am not going to sit here and tell you Russ Feldman was a fraud from the beginning. He believed it. The company got good. We got very good. I have to back up and tell you about Russ in the early years, because if I don't, the man who moved the motion is just a coward in a suit, and that is a lie, and this whole story is worthless if I let you believe it. We started in 2002 in a rented unit with a used centrifuge and a second mortgage on my house, mine, not his, because he had nothing and I had a house. And for the first 2 years, there was no money at all. And Russ Feldman worked for 11 months for nothing. Not reduced. Nothing. He had a wife and a baby, and he drove a car with a hole in the floor, and he came in every day and he ran samples, and he did not take a dollar out of that company for 11 months. And I did not have to ask him, and he never once mentioned it again for 20 years. Not once. Not in an argument, not at a party, never. And it was Russ who did the thing that actually built us. In 2006, we had our first real test. A client who wanted a result, a medium-sized one, nothing like Bracken, and I was out of state, and Russ handled it, and the client leaned on him hard, and Russ told him no, and the client said, "Do you know what this is worth?" And Russ said, and this became a legend in my building for 20 years, Russ said, "Sir, if I say yes to you today, then my yes is worth nothing tomorrow, and then what exactly are you buying from me next year?" That's not my line. That's his. That is a Russ Feldman original, delivered when he was 34 years old and broke, to a man who could have ended us, and we lost that client, and 8 months later that man came back and gave us 3 times the work because he had gone around the industry and discovered that we were the only lab anybody could name who had ever told him no. Russ built the no as much as I did. That is what I need you to understand. The man who moved the motion to fire me for saying no in 2023 was the man who invented saying no in 2006. Nothing was done to him. That's what I can't get past. Nobody bribed Russ Feldman. Nobody threatened him. All that happened to Russ Feldman between 2006 and 2023 is that he got comfortable, and his kids got into good schools, and his mortgage got bigger, and one client became 60%, and 17 years went by. That's it. That's the entire crime. Nothing happened to him at all except time and a number. And that terrifies me more than any villain I have ever met, because if it can get that man, if it can get the 34-year-old with the hole in his floorboard who invented our no, then there is no one on this earth it can't get, and everybody listening to this who thinks they'd be different is exactly as sure as Russ was. By 2015, we were 140 people, we were the lab you called when it mattered, and here is the thing that I could not make anybody on my board understand at the end. Our margins were fine, our reputation was the best in 3 states, and the reason for both of those things was the 20% rule. People hired us because we could say no. The rule was not a constraint on the business. The rule was the business. And then we took on Bracken. Bracken Global is one of the largest infrastructure contractors in North America, and in 2019 they came to us with an enormous program of work, and it was, I want to be honest, the most exciting thing that had ever happened to my company. It was real work, important work, exactly the kind of work I got into this to do. And it was too big. It was too big on the day they offered it, and I knew it was too big, and I took it anyway. I want to say that clearly, because I have spent 4 years listening to people tell me I was the hero of this story, and I was not. I broke my own rule. Nobody made me. There was no crisis, no gun to my head. I did not need the money. I broke the rule I had built the entire company on because I was 60 years old and I wanted one time to work on the biggest thing in the state, and because everybody in my building was thrilled, and because Russ said the thing that men say, which was, "Gene, we're a different company now, we're strong enough to handle it." And I let myself be convinced, and the truth underneath all of it is much smaller and much more human than any strategic argument. I wanted it. My father was a maintenance electrician, and I wanted my name on the biggest job in the state. So we took it, and inside of 18 months, Bracken was 35% of us. And then, because that is what a client like that does, because you get good at serving them and they give you more and you hire people to serve them more, and now those people have mortgages. By 2022, Bracken Global was 60% of the revenue of Terran Analytical. 60%. I had built the entire company to prevent one number, and I stood there and let it happen to me one perfectly reasonable quarter at a time. Everybody who works in one of these places is nodding right now because you have watched it. It is happening to you as you listen to this. And the terrible thing about it is that there is never a day where you decide. There's no meeting. It just accumulates, and every individual step is defensible. And then one morning you wake up and your entire company works for one customer and you have no idea how you got there. And here is what I want you to understand about what that number does to a building full of people, because this is the part nobody talks about. It did not corrupt me. Not at first. Corrupted everybody around me. Long before the crisis, I could feel my company change. People started saying, "Our friends at Bracken." A junior guy asked a manager whether a finding was going to be a problem, and he did not mean a problem for the bridge. Russ started taking their calls first. And I would sit in my office and tell myself that I was still the same man with the same rule and the same sign-in sheet in my drawer, but the building was not, because 140 people had figured out where their mortgage came from, and no speech about the no could compete with that arithmetic point. 60% does not buy your integrity. It just quietly rearranges everybody around you so that when the day comes, you are standing alone in a room you built, and everyone you love is on the other side of the table, and they are not villains, they are just people with kids and a number. And then, in the spring of 2023, the day came. Let me tell you exactly how it started, because it did not start with a bribe or a threat. It started with a phone call from a man being very reasonable. The findings came out of routine work. I am deliberately not going to walk you through the technical detail, partly because it would take an hour and partly because it does not matter to this story and partly because there are still lawyers involved. Here is what you need. Our testing on a Bracken program turned up a problem. Not a borderline call, not a judgment thing. Pattern. My people found it, and then they did what my people do, which is they went and looked harder, and the harder they looked, the worse it got. And by the end of 6 weeks, we had a picture that said this is systemic and this is going to have to be dealt with now at enormous cost by somebody. And the somebody was Bracken Global. Wanda Osei brought it to me. Wanda has run quality at my lab for 20 years, and she is the most careful human being I have ever met. And she came into my office and shut the door, which she has done maybe 4 times in 20 years, and she put the file down and she said, "Gene, I've had 3 people rerun this independently. I need you to look at it, and then I need you to tell me you're going to sign it, because if you're not going to sign it, I need to know today." That is the best employee I ever had. Right there, in one sentence. She did not ask me if it was true. She knew it was true. She asked me if I was going to be a man about it, and she asked me on day 1, before anybody had leaned on anybody, because Wanda Osei had been in this industry for 30 years and she knew exactly what was coming, and she wanted to know immediately which kind of company she worked for. Let me tell you about Wanda, because she is the actual hero of this and she would be furious that I said so. I hired her in 2003 to run samples. She had a chemistry degree from a school nobody in this industry respects and 11 years of experience at a lab that had gone under. And she was 34 and she was the 3rd best candidate on paper, and I hired her because of one thing she said in the interview. I asked her the question I asked everybody, which was, "Tell me about a time you made a mistake." And every candidate gives you the fake one, the humble brag, "I care too much, I work too hard." And Wanda Osei sat there and told me in detail with dates about a specific error she had personally made 9 years earlier. A real one, a bad one that cost her employer money, and how it was caught and by whom, and exactly what she changed in her own practice afterward, and it took her 4 minutes and she never once looked away. I hired her before she was out of the parking lot. Because a person who can say the true thing about themselves out loud, unprompted, to a stranger who is deciding whether to feed their family, is a person whose name you can put on a certificate. And here is the thing I did wrong with Wanda, and it is the same thing I did wrong with everything. For 20 years, she and I were the only 2 approved signatories at the top scope, and I told myself that was rigor. It wasn't. It was ego. Somewhere in there, and I did not see it until she fixed it. I liked being the man whose name was on it. I liked that the buck stopped at Gene Tarrant. I dressed it up in Hector Ruiz and accountability, and there was truth in that, but underneath the truth there was a 60-year-old man who liked being the last honest signature in the building, and it never once occurred to me that a lab whose integrity depends on 2 people is a lab that can be beaten by removing 2 people. They only removed 1. That is the only reason I am telling you a story with an ending instead of a story like 1988. They only bothered to remove 1 because they only ever saw 1, because to them Wanda Osei was a quality manager, which in their vocabulary means an administrator, which means fungible. They fired the founder and left the actual load-bearing wall standing, because they could not tell which one it was. And I read it, and it took me about 4 minutes to see it, and I said, "Of course I'm going to sign it." She let out this breath. 20 years. And she still had to ask. So we issued a preliminary. And the next day I got the call from Bracken, and it was not a gangster, I want to be very clear, it was a perfectly pleasant senior man named Curtis Rhodes. And here is approximately what he said, and I want you to notice that not one word of it is a threat. He said, "Gene, we've obviously got a serious situation, and nobody's disputing your data, your people are excellent, we've always said that. But we think the scope's wrong. We think you've been asked the wrong question." And what he meant when you translated it was that if you reframed the assessment against a different standard, and you narrowed the sample population, and you treated the whole thing as a series of unrelated local issues rather than one systemic pattern, then every individual piece of it becomes a manageable, defensible, ordinary problem. Nothing false. Every single number stays exactly the same. You just ask a different question, and the different question has an answer that costs $40 million instead of $600 million, and everybody goes home. And Gene, he said, and this is the sentence I want you to hear because this is what it actually sounds like when it happens to you. It does not sound like corruption. It sounds like a reasonable senior man being warm on the phone. He said, nobody's asking you to change a result. We're just asking you to be reasonable about the framing. You've got 140 people over there. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. That's it. That's the whole thing. That is what they said to the lab that signed the report in 1988. Nobody in the history of the world has ever been asked to do the wrong thing by somebody who called it the wrong thing. They call it framing. They call it scope. They call it being reasonable, and they are pleasant on the phone, and they mention in a warm and caring voice how many people you employ. And I said no. And then it took 11 days. 11 days from my no to my board firing me, and I want to walk you through it because the machinery is the most interesting thing in this story. Day 1, Bracken stopped talking to me and started talking to Russ. That's the first move, always. They didn't fight my no, they routed around it. Day 3, my chairman, a man named Dale Prosser who represented the investors who had bought 40% of my company in 2016. And yes, that is a whole other mistake, and yes, I made it and I will get to it. Prosser calls me and says he's hearing about a client relationship issue. Let me get to it now, actually, because it is the mistake that made all the others possible. In 2016, I sold 40% of Tarrant Analytical to an investment group. Nobody made me. I was not in trouble. Here is the entire reason, and it is so stupid and so ordinary that I am embarrassed to say it out loud. My daughter was finishing school, and Ruth and I had never taken any real money out of the business in 14 years, and I was 54 years old, and every asset I had in this world was locked inside one company. And a very pleasant man explained to me that this was concentration risk and that responsible people take some chips off the table. Concentration risk. That's what he called it. And I sat there and nodded because I am a man who has built an entire life around the danger of concentration, and I thought I was being prudent. And here is what actually happened, which nobody explains to you at the time. I diversified my personal balance sheet and I concentrated my company's soul. I took my chips off the table, and in exchange I put 4 seats at my table and gave them to people whose entire and only relationship with my company was a number on a spreadsheet in a fund in another state. They had never met Wanda. They had never heard of Hector Ruiz. They had no idea what a signatory was and no reason to ever find out because they were not in the laboratory business, they were in the money business, and my lab was one line in a portfolio and it either performed or it didn't. For 7 years it did not matter. That's the trap. For 7 years Dale Prosser was a perfectly good board member who asked sharp questions and never interfered with anything technical. And I would have told you in 2022 that taking that investment was one of the better decisions of my life. Because it doesn't matter until the day it's the only thing that matters. I sold 40% of my company for money I did not need, to people who could not possibly understand what they were buying, and 7 years later 4 of the 7 votes that fired me for refusing to soften a safety finding belonged to that decision. They were not corrupt. They did exactly what they existed to do. I invited them in, I told them their job was to maximize the value of their position, and then on a Thursday afternoon in April they did their job precisely, and I have absolutely no grounds to complain about it. You cannot let those people through the door and then be shocked when they behave like themselves. That is not their betrayal. That's my invoice. A client relationship issue. Wanda's file. Day 5. A special board meeting is called, and I am told the agenda is strategic risk. Day 7, Russ comes to my office. I have to tell you about Russ coming to my office because it is the worst hour of the whole thing. Worse than the vote. Russ Feldman and I started this company in a rented unit with a used centrifuge. He was best man at my wedding. When my daughter was born 11 weeks early, Russ Feldman slept in the hospital parking lot for 4 nights because Ruth and I couldn't both leave and somebody had to run the lab, and he ran the lab and he slept in the lot so he could be there if we called. That is who this man is. That is not a colleague. That is a brother. And he sat down in my office and he said, "Gene, you have to give me something. Give me something I can take to them. Just soften it. 2 lines. Give me a footnote. Give me an in certain conditions. Give me anything and I can hold this together." And I said, "Russ, you know what's in the file." And he said, and he was not lying, and that is the thing that has taken me 4 years to be able to say out loud. He said, "I do. And I've read it, and Gene, I don't think it's as clear as Wanda thinks it is. I honestly don't. He believed that. That's the part. My friend of 22 years sat in my office and had, sincerely, honestly, arrived at a place where a file he could not have argued with in 2005 now looked to him like a judgment call. 60% had gotten into his head one perfectly reasonable quarter at a time, the same way it got into everybody's, and the horror of it, the actual horror of this whole story, is that he was not bought. There is no payment. There is no moment. He just could not afford the no anymore, so his mind, which is a good mind, went and found him a reason, and it presented the reason to him as his own honest opinion, and he believed it, and he will believe it until he dies. That is what money does. It does not corrupt people. It redecorates their conscience while they're asleep in it. And then I said the thing that ended our friendship, and I said it quietly, and I have never taken it back. I said, Russ, Hector Ruiz. And he flinched like I'd hit him, because he has known about that sign-in sheet for 22 years, and he said, that is not fair. And I said, no, it isn't. And he left. Day 11, Thursday, the vote. I want to describe the room because it was the most ordinary room in the world. 7 people around a table, coffee, somebody's phone buzzing. And Dale Prosser, who is not a monster either, who is a fun guy in his 50s with a fiduciary duty to his investors and a genuine, actual, defensible argument, laid it out, and here is his argument, and I want you to hear it fairly, because if you do not hear it fairly you will not understand how ordinary this is. Gene Tarrant has taken an inflexible position that will cost this company 60% of its revenue. 60% of revenue means the company does not survive it, or survives it at half its size. Half its size means we let go of somewhere north of 60 people. 60 people is 60 families. The board's duty is to the company and its shareholders and, yes, its employees. One man's judgment call, and Prosser used the word judgment over and over because that is the word you use. One man's judgment call is not worth 60 families. Nobody is asking anyone to falsify anything. We are simply asking for a different technical opinion, and the client has indicated that under new leadership, the relationship can be preserved. And then he said the words. He looked at me and he said, Gene, it's not personal, and it's not about your integrity. It's about scale. You're not the right man for the company we are now. You're not the right man for the company we are now. 22 years. And do you know what the awful thing is? He was right. I was not the right man for what they had become. That was the truest sentence spoken in that room all day. I did say one thing. I want to tell you what it was because it took me the whole 11 days to find it, and it is the only thing I said in that room, and it did not work. I did not argue about the data. There was no point, none of them could read it. I did not appeal to 22 years, because sentiment is exactly what Prosser was there to overcome, and I was not going to hand him the win. What I said was this. I said, everyone in this room is about to vote for a version of this company that can be reasonable about the framing. I want you to think for 1 minute about what that company is worth. Because there are 200 labs in this country that will tell Bracken Global whatever Bracken Global would like to hear, and every one of them is cheaper than us, and Bracken uses us anyway. Ask yourselves why. They are not paying our rates for our equipment. Everybody has the same equipment. They are paying our rates because when Tarrant Analytical signs, it settles the question. And it settles the question because we're the people who wouldn't. The day we become the lab that can be reasonable about the framing, we are worth exactly what those 200 other labs are worth, which is nothing, and Bracken will drop us inside of 3 years because a bought lab is no use to anybody, including the man who bought it. You are not protecting 60% of the revenue. You are destroying the only reason it exists. And that is a good argument. That is, I think, actually the correct argument, and it is the true one, and I had 11 days to build it and I delivered it well. And Dale Prosser waited, politely, for me to finish, and then he said, that's a long-term view, Gene, and I don't disagree with all of it. But we have to survive the quarter to have a long term. And that was that. 7 to 1. I have thought about that exchange for 4 years, and here is what I finally understand. I was not out-argued. I was outclocked. Everything I said was true over 5 years, and everything Prosser said was true over 5 months. And the man whose horizon is shorter always wins the meeting because the meeting is today. That is the whole mechanism. That is how every institution in this world gets hollowed out. Not by people who disagree with the long view, by people who agree with it and have to survive the quarter over and over forever until there is no long anymore. And they voted 7-1. Russ moved the motion because Prosser made him do it, because a founder removal always gets moved by the friend. That is not an accident, that is a technique. And they voted me out as CEO and off my own board, and they had a package for me, a very generous package with a very ordinary set of covenants in it, and they installed a nice, competent 44-year-old man from Bracken's world as acting chief executive, and they went out and told the world it was a planned transition. And I shook Russ's hand, and I walked out to my car, and I sat there and I laughed. And then I drove home and I did not laugh anymore, because I had to walk into my kitchen and tell my wife. Ruth was at the counter. 41 years. And I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and I could not get the sentence out. And she looked at me and she said, "They did it, didn't they?" And I said yes. And here is what my wife said, and I want every person listening to hear this, because I have thought about it every day since. She did not say those bastards. She did not say we'll fight it. She did not ask about money, and we had plenty of reasons to ask about money. She dried her hands, and she looked at me across the kitchen, and she said, "Did you sign it?" That's it. That's all she wanted to know. 41 years of marriage, the company gone, her husband humiliated by his best friend. And the only thing Ruth Tarrant needed to know at 4 in the afternoon on the worst day of my professional life was whether I had put my name on the true thing. And I said, "I signed it." And she said, "Then it's just a job, Gene." And she went back to the counter. It's just a job. 22 years, 140 people, my name on the building, and my wife called it a job, and she was completely right, and I have never loved another human being the way I loved her in that 10 seconds. And then, about an hour later, she came out to the garage where I was pretending to look for something, and she said one more thing, and this is the one that actually did it, this is the one that put me on the floor. She said, "Gene, Hector's family never got to ask him that question." And then she left me alone out there, and I stood in my garage for a while. That is why I filed. Not for revenge. Not because I'm brave. Because a woman in a kitchen asked me if I'd signed it, and because a woman I never met never got to ask her husband anything ever again, and because those two facts are the only two facts I have ever really had. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you the question I sat with in that parking lot, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer, because the easy answer is a lie. Prosser was not wrong. 60 people would have lost their jobs. 60 families, real ones, in a real town, and I was standing there insisting on a document. So, how much does your no cost before it stops being integrity and starts being vanity? At what point does a principled man become just an expensive man who is making other people pay for his conscience? Because I have been told to my face by good people that the 60 families are on me. And Prosser, who is a bad man in this story, was the only person in that room who said out loud that 60 families were going to be hurt. Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I have never once, not in 4 years, been fully certain, and anybody who tells you this one is easy has never sat in that parking lot. Now let me tell you what I was laughing about. Here is what nobody in that room had ever checked. Not Prosser, not the investors, not Bracken's lawyers, not one of the 7 people who voted. And here is the thing, it was not hidden. It was not a trap. It was not clever. It was written on the wall of the lobby, and it was in every report we had issued for 22 years, and it was in our accreditation documents, which are public, and every single one of them had walked past it every day for years and never once understood what they were looking at. A testing laboratory's certified report is not valid because the company issued it. A company cannot have an opinion. A certified report is valid because a named, individually approved, personally accountable human being signed it. Under our accreditation, the laboratory holds the scope, but the authority to sign, to release, to certify, that attaches to approved signatories, and an approved signatory is a person. Named, assessed, approved individually by the accreditation body, based on that specific human being's qualifications and record, and it is not transferable, and it does not come with the office, and it does not belong to the shareholders. It is not an asset of the company. You cannot vote it to someone else. It is a professional standing held by a person the way a surgeon holds a license, and my company could no more transfer it than they could transfer my medical history. And in 22 years, Tarrant Analytical had exactly 2 approved signatories at the level required for the Bracken scope of work. Gene Tarrant and Wanda Osei. That is it. That is the whole card. There was never anything more sophisticated than that. And I want to tell you the 2 reasons it was that way because they matter. The first reason is that I did it on purpose in 2002, and I did it because of Hector Ruiz. Because the lesson of 1988 was that a company signs papers and a company cannot be shamed, cannot be ruined, cannot lie awake, cannot look at a sign-in sheet in a drawer. So I built my lab so that every certified word that left my building had one specific human being's name on it, personally, permanently, accountably, and I made myself one of the 2 at the top on the worst jobs forever, so that there would never be a piece of paper in this world with my company's name on it that I could hide behind. I did not do it to protect myself. I did it to make sure I could never escape. And the second reason is that in 22 years, nobody ever asked. Nobody. Not the investors who did 4 months of due diligence in 2016. Not Prosser, who sat on my board for 7 years. Not Bracken's people. Because in their world, the world of decks and models and enterprise value, a company is a box that contains assets, and the assets are the machines and the contracts and people are fungible. That is the actual technical term they use, fungible, meaning interchangeable, meaning if you take one out, you put another one in and the box keeps producing. They looked at my lab for 7 years and they saw a box that produced certified reports. It did not occur to a single one of them to ask what a certified report actually is. So on that Thursday afternoon, my board of directors voted 7-1 to remove the man whose personal signature was the only thing that made 90% of their high-scope work legally valid. They fired the license. They fired it at a table in a room in about 40 minutes with coffee, and they went home and told their wives they'd had a tough day and made a hard call. Let me tell you what happened on Monday. On Monday morning, Wanda Osei resigned. She did not resign in protest, and I want to be precise about that, because it is the single most elegant thing anybody did in this entire story, and it is the reason I still get emotional talking about her. Wanda did not make a speech. Wanda did not send an all-staff email. Wanda Osei walked into the new acting chief executive's office at 8 in the morning with a 2-line letter and resigned. Effective immediately, for personal reasons, and then she went and cleaned out her desk and hugged 4 people and drove home. And she did not call me first. I want that on the record. That woman took the single most consequential action of the last 4 years, an action that dismantled a $150 million strategy. And she did not consult me, she did not warn me, she did not ask me for anything, and I did not know until she was already in her car. Because Wanda Osei is not a soldier in somebody's war, she is a professional, and she had asked me her one question 3 weeks earlier, are you going to sign it? And she had gotten her answer, and then she watched a board fire the man who said yes and install a man whose entire assignment was to produce a different opinion. And Wanda Osei was not going to have her personal, individual, professionally accountable, non-transferable signature on that. That's all. That's the whole thing. Nobody made her. They would have paid her anything to stay. They figured that out by about 9:40. She just wasn't going to sign it, and if you are not going to sign it, you cannot stay because the only thing they needed her for was to sign it. I called her that night, and I want to tell you this conversation because it is 30 seconds long and it is the best 30 seconds in this whole story. I said, Wanda, what are you going to do? And she said, I've got about 9 months of savings, Gene, and I'm 56 years old in an industry where everybody's going to know exactly why I left. And I said, I'm sorry. And Wanda Osei said, don't. I've been in this business 30 years and I've watched a lot of people find out what they'd sign. Now I know what I wouldn't. That's worth 9 months. That's it. That's the whole call. She has never once, in 4 years, asked me for anything. Not a job, not a reference, not a dollar. When I bought back into the company and asked her to run it, she made me interview her. I am not exaggerating. She sat across a table from me and made me explain what my expectations were and what the compensation was and what the governance would look like. And at the end of it, she said she'd think about it, and she took 4 days. 4 days. To decide whether to be handed a company. And when she called back, she said yes, and then she said, one condition. If you ever come into this building and tell me what to sign, I'm gone that afternoon, and I won't discuss it. And I said, Wanda, that's the only reason I'm asking you. And she said, I know. I still needed it out loud. So by 8:15 on Monday morning, Tarrant Analytical, one of the most respected testing laboratories in the country, had 0 approved signatories for its highest scope work. 0. They did not know it at 8:15. That is my favorite part. They thought they had lost a quality manager and they were mildly annoyed. It took them until roughly Wednesday to understand what had actually happened to them, and I know the exact hour because Theo Brandt, one of my young engineers, called me on Wednesday afternoon just to say, "Gene, they've gone very quiet up there." Here is what had gone quiet. A report came up for release, and there was nobody who could sign it. And somebody senior said, "Fine, I'll sign it," and somebody more senior said, "You're not an approved signatory for that scope." And they said, "Well, approve me." And that is the moment right there, that is the exact moment this entire story turns, because the answer is you cannot. Not internally. Not by resolution of the board. An approved signatory is approved by the accreditation body, based on documented individual competence and experience after an assessment, and that process takes months, and you have to have somebody to put through it. And my lab's entire senior technical bench under Wanda had spent 20 years doing brilliant work under two signatories, because that is how I built it, deliberately, to make sure the accountability could never diffuse. So, they could not issue certified reports at the required scope. Which meant Bracken Global's program, the one that was 60% of my revenue, the one they had just torn the company apart to protect, could not receive valid certified results from Terran Analytical. Not softened results. Not reframed results. Any results. Bracken's projects stopped. Not all of them, I want to be accurate, but the ones that mattered, and they stopped hard because you cannot pour, you cannot close out, you cannot proceed past a hold point without a valid certified report, and there was not another lab in the region who could pick up that scope in under 6 months, and the ones who could were now being asked to come in and redo work on a program where the previous lab's entire senior technical staff had just walked out, which is, in my industry, a message, written in letters 4 feet high. And by Friday, Dale Prosser had figured out what he had done. And Dale Prosser called me. I want to tell you about that call because I did something on that call that I did not plan and that I am still, for years later, a little bit surprised by. He was pleasant. He was so pleasant. He had gotten there overnight, you could hear it, he had done the reading, and he understood now, and he was in that state that a certain kind of very smart man gets into when the ground has gone, where he is talking fast and being very charming and reframing everything as a misunderstanding among reasonable people. He said the board had perhaps acted precipitously. He said there was a path back, an important role, a chief scientific officer thing, a seat, real money, and he actually said this, "Obviously we'd want you signing again immediately." And I said, "Dale, what do you want me to sign?" And there was this pause. And in that pause I heard the entire rest of my life, and I want you to hear it too because everything I did after that call came out of those 2 seconds of silence, in which Dale Prosser was deciding whether to say the true thing out loud on a recorded line. And what he said was, "We can obviously discuss the scope. We can obviously discuss the scope." They had just been humiliated. Their client's program was frozen. Their company was, in that moment, technically incapable of doing the only thing it existed to do. And the thing Dale Prosser wanted in the very first conversation before anything else was still the same thing. He wanted the man with the pen back in the building, and he wanted the pen pointed in a particular direction. He had learned nothing. He had learned the mechanics. He now understood exactly what a signatory was, and about the actual thing, about the reason any of it exists, he had learned absolutely nothing at all. And I said, "No, Dale, we can't." And I hung up, and that was the last time I ever spoke to Dale Prosser. Now I have to tell you the hardest part of this story, which is what I did next, because it is the part where people who love this story stop loving it. I did not use it. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because everybody assumes I did. I had them. I had them completely. I could have sat on my hands for 6 weeks and let Bracken's program bleed and let the board come to me on their knees, and I could have named a number, and the number could have been almost anything, and I would have gotten it, and everybody would have called it justice. And that would have made me a man who used a bridge as a bargaining chip. Do you see it? That's the trap. That is the beautiful, perfect, invisible trap, and I want anybody listening who has ever held leverage over somebody who wronged them to sit with this for a second, because it is the hardest thing I have ever had to see. The moment I use the frozen projects as leverage, the moment I say, "Put me back on my terms and I'll sign," I have done exactly what Bracken did. I have taken the public safety and turned it into a chip in a negotiation about my own position. The only difference between me and Curtis Rhodes at that point is which way the pen is pointing, and if the pen can point either way for the right price, then I never had a no at all, I just had a higher price than Russ did. So I did not do that. Instead, I did the boring thing. The thing that does not make a good movie. I took the findings to the owner, not the press. I want to be very clear because people always want the press. Not the press. Bracken Global was building for a public authority, the actual owner, the people who were paying for it, the people whose job it is to receive exactly this kind of information. And there is a process for this, an unglamorous, tedious, deeply documented process, and I had standing to use it because I was the signatory of record on the original certified work. So on the following Tuesday I filed. Properly. With the file. With Wanda's data, with the 3 independent reruns, with the chain of custody, with everything through the front door, with my name on it, personally the way I have put my name on everything for 22 years. And then I went home and mowed my lawn. That is genuinely what I did. I filed the most consequential document of my professional life at 11 in the morning, and I was home mowing my lawn by 2. And Ruth came out and looked at me and said, "Well," and I said, "It's not mine anymore." And she said, "Good." And went back inside, and that is 41 years of marriage in 4 words. Because that is the whole thing. That is the only actual moral of this entire story, and I want to give it to you now instead of at the end. Your no is not a weapon. The second you use your no as a weapon, it stops being a no and becomes a price. You do not get to hold the truth hostage to get your company back. You just tell the truth to the people whose truth it is, and then you let go of the rope, and whatever happens next happens next. What happened next was an 18-month investigation, and I am not going to walk you through it because it was tedious and technical and mostly involved rooms with bad carpet. But I do want to tell you what those 18 months cost because the movie version cuts from the filing to the vindication, and there is a reason nobody films the middle. For 18 months, I was professionally radioactive. Not because anybody thought I was wrong, because I was inconvenient. There is no industry in this world that likes the man who filed. I lost friends, real ones, 30-year ones, not because they disagreed with me, but because being seen at lunch with me was a statement they had not signed up to make. I got exactly 1 job offer in 18 months, from a man who wanted my name on his letterhead precisely because it would frighten his clients, which is its own kind of insult. And the lawyers. 8 months in, Bracken's people took my deposition, and it lasted 2 days, and I want to tell you what a deposition like that actually is, because it is the most educational thing that has ever happened to me. They did not ask me about the data. Not once in 2 days. They asked me about 2019, about the day I broke my own 20% rule. They asked me, in about 9 different ways, whether it was true that Gene Tarrant, the great man of principle, had personally abandoned his own governing rule the moment a big enough number was waved at him. And every single one of those questions was fair. And I answered all of them yes. That was the strategy, and it was a good one. It does not matter whether the data is right, it only matters whether the man is clean, and no man is clean, and any competent lawyer can find the exact place where you sold out and hold it up to the light. They found mine in about 4 minutes because it was right there in my own board minutes. My one hypocrisy, the one time in 22 years, and they built 2 days around it. And here's why it did not work, and this is the thing I want anyone in a fight like this to hear. It did not work because Wanda's data did not care who I was. That is the entire genius of a certified process. The file did not need me to be a good man. 3 independent reruns by 3 people with their own names on them, a documented chain of custody, an independent lab's confirmation. The truth in that file was not resting on Gene Tarrant's character, and so Bracken could take my character apart and did for 2 days, and at the end of it the bridge still had the same problem it had in the spring. Build the truth so it doesn't need you to be innocent, because they will find out you're not. I promise you, whatever it is, they will find it, and they will read it out loud in a room with bad carpet while your wife sits behind you. Here is where it landed. The findings were substantially confirmed. Independent labs, the authorities' own people, everybody. Wanda Osei was right, and my file was right, and the remediation cost was, in the end, a great deal more than $600 million, and it fell where it should have fallen, which was on Bracken Global. Curtis Rhodes, the pleasant man on the phone, is gone from that industry. Not in a cell, I have to be honest with you about that, because people always want the cell, and the world does not work that way, and he was very careful, he never said one prosecutable word to me, but gone. Because he had to explain, to a public authority and eventually to a legislature, why the laboratory that found the problem had its founder removed 11 days later at his company's request. He had to explain the timeline. Nobody can explain that timeline. There is no answer to that timeline. And Bracken, which is bigger than all of us and will outlive all of us, discovered the one thing that is actually expensive in this world, which is that for about 3 years no serious counterparty in North America wanted to be in a room with them, because if you will do that to a lab, what do you do to a partner? And my board. Dale Prosser's fund did not lose everything, they never do. But he had personally driven a company into a wall that was, and I want to stress this, painted bright orange, documented publicly, and visible from space to anybody who bothered to ask one question. In his world, you are allowed to lose money. You are not allowed to be a fool in public. He is doing something else now. The investor group unwound their position at a loss, and I bought a meaningful chunk of it back at that loss, personally, with the very generous severance package they had given me 11 months earlier, which I want to point out is the single funniest thing that has ever happened to me. They paid me to leave, and I used the money to buy their shares off them cheap when they ran. And then I went back. Not as CEO. I want to say why, because everybody expects the triumphant return, and that is not what this was. 140 people worked at Terran Analytical, and about 90 of them were still there, and they had spent a year and a half being the lab from the news, having their competence questioned at conferences, watching their livelihood swing on decisions no one had asked them about. They had done nothing wrong. Theo Brandt, 29 years old, had spent 18 months explaining to his in-laws why his company was in the paper. So yes, I went back because they were mine, and because I built this thing and I broke my own rule and I am the reason it happened, and you do not get to walk away from a fire you started because you were technically standing outside the room when the match dropped. I want to tell you about the first morning I walked back into that building, because it did not go the way you think. Nobody cheered. I want to be very clear about that, because in the version of this story that people want, the founder walks back onto the floor and there is applause. There was no applause. There were about 90 people who had been through 18 months of hell, and they looked up, and it was quiet, and a woman I had known for 12 years, a lab tech named Carol, said, out loud in front of everybody, "Where were you?" And that is the fairest question anybody asked me in the whole 4 years. Because from where Carol stood, here's what happened. The owner had a fight with a client, the owner lost, the owner took a very generous severance package and went home, and for a year and a half she came to work in a building with a hole in the middle of it and had to explain to her sister-in-law why her company was in the news. I filed a report. Great. She did not file a report. She just had to live in it. I did not have a good answer for Carol. I still don't. What I said was, I was doing the only thing I could think of, and I don't know if it was right, and I'm sorry. And she nodded, and she went back to work, and it took about 6 months before that building trusted me again, and it should have. Because here is the ugly little truth underneath every one of these stories, mine included. The man who takes the principled stand almost always has a cushion. I had a house that was paid off. I had a package. I had 40 years of reputation and a phone that still rang. My no was affordable. Not because I'm brave, because I'm rich enough. And Carol's no was not affordable, and Theo's no was not affordable at 29 with a new baby, and Russ Feldman's no had stopped being affordable somewhere around his second kid's tuition. And the reason I am the one standing here narrating this like a hero is substantially that I could afford the ticket and they couldn't. That's not immoral. That's just true. Anybody who tells you integrity is free has never had to buy any. But I went back for a year, and I went back to do exactly 2 things. The first was to put the rule back in writing, and this time to put it somewhere a board cannot vote it away. No client above 20%. It is in the charter now. It took 9 months and a lot of lawyers, and it is the only thing I am proud of in this entire story, because a rule that depends on one stubborn old man is not a rule, it is a personality. I learned that the hard way. My whole company's integrity for 22 years was a personality trait of Gene Tarrant's, and it survived exactly as long as Gene Tarrant did, which was until a Thursday afternoon in April. That's not a company. That's a cult of personality with a laboratory attached. So I built the fence in writing so it will hold when I am gone, which is the only kind of fence that matters. And the second thing was to hire Wanda Osei back and make her chief executive and then get out of her way and then 11 months later retire. She runs it now. She has run it for 2 years. And in her second month, she made one change that I did not think of, and it is better than everything I ever did. She made it so that Terran Analytical has 11 approved signatories, and every single one of them is trained, assessed, and personally accountable, and any one of them can stop any job in the building. I built a lab where the no depended on one man. Wanda built a lab where the no depends on 11 people, which means you would have to corrupt 11 human beings, individually at once, and one of them will always say something. She fixed my company's actual flaw, which was me. That is what a real successor does. That is what I thought I was getting when I gave Russ the moon and a partnership, and it turned out to be a woman I hired to run samples in 2003. And Russ Feldman took his package and he left about 4 months after I did, and he did not go to Bracken and he did not go anywhere, he just went. And I did not speak to him for 3 years. He called me last spring, and I let it ring. And then I called him back, because I am 71 and Ruth has had a health scare and I have started thinking about the arithmetic of remaining Sundays. We met at a diner. He looks old. He is old, we both are. And he did not apologize, and I want to tell you why that mattered, because I expected to need it and it turns out I didn't. What he said was, "I still think it was a judgment call, Gene. I've read that report 100 times. I still see it different than you do." And then he said, "And I moved the motion because Prosser told me if I didn't, he'd have you removed for cause instead and take your equity," and I believed him, and I have never known, not one day since, whether I did that to protect you or because I wanted a reason. And I said, "Neither do I, Russ." And we ate our eggs. That's it. That's the whole reconciliation. We have breakfast every few weeks now, and we do not discuss it, and we are not what we were and we never will be. And here is the thing I have finally understood at 71. He is not a villain and I am not a hero, and the actual truth is that Russ Feldman was a good man who worked for 18 years at a company that could afford its conscience, and then 4 years at one that couldn't, and the second one is what he'll be remembered for, and it isn't fair and it's true. That's what 60% does. It doesn't find the bad people. It makes the good ones ordinary. There is one more thing about Russ and then I'm done with him. At that diner, at the end, when we were putting our coats on, he said, and he said it lightly, the way men say the thing that has been sitting on their chest for 4 years, he said, "You know the worst part? I was better at it than you were." The saying no. In 06, I was better at it than you. And I said, "I know." And he said, "So what happened?" And I did not have an answer for him in that parking lot, and I have one now, and I am never going to get to give it to him because you cannot say a thing like this to a man over eggs. Here it is. Nothing happened to you, Russ. That's what happened. Nothing happened to you for 17 years. You never got tested. Not once. From 2006 to 2023, nobody ever asked you for anything you couldn't afford to refuse, and so you thought the thing you did at 34 was who you were, when it was actually just what the price was that year. You were a man with a hole in his floorboard, and a man with a hole in his floorboard can say anything to anybody. And then, slowly, over 17 years, we made you comfortable, and comfort is not corruption. Comfort is just the absence of any reason to find out. And then somebody finally asked you at 51 with 2 kids in good schools and you found out. We all find out. That's the only thing I know for sure at 71. Everybody in this world is exactly one big enough number away from finding out, and the ones who never find out are not better people, they are just people nobody ever bothered to ask. I got asked at 61. He got asked at 51. I had a paid-off house and he had tuition. That is not the difference between a good man and a bad man. That is the difference between 2 men on the day the phone rang. My name is Gene Tarrant, and here is what I need you to take, and then I'll let you go. Everyone thinks integrity is a virtue. It isn't. Integrity is a budget item. I want you to really hear that because it is the most useful thing I know and nobody teaches it. Every person who ever did the wrong thing at work was a decent human being on the day they took the job. They did not become corrupt. They became dependent, and then their conscience quietly rearranged itself around what they could afford, and their own mind handed them a reasonable-sounding argument and told them it was their honest opinion. That is not a character flaw. That is arithmetic, and it will happen to you, and it will happen to me. It did happen to me in 2019 when I broke my own rule because I wanted my name on the biggest job in the state. So do not sit around trying to be a person of integrity. Everybody's a person of integrity right up until the invoice. Instead, go look at your own numbers today, tonight, and find out what percentage of your life is controlled by one customer, one employer, one client, one person. And whatever that number is, if it is high, then you do not have principles. You have permission. You have exactly as much conscience as that number allows you, and on the day it is tested, and it will be tested, it always gets tested, they always ask, you will discover that your no was never yours. It was theirs. You were just holding it for them. Build the fence while it's cheap. Say no to money you don't need. Keep your no affordable because your no is the only thing you actually own, and I promise you one day somebody very pleasant is going to call you on the phone and ask you warmly, using your first name, mentioning your family, to be reasonable about the framing. So let me leave you with the question, and I want a real answer because I have never settled it in 4 years. My board was not wrong about the 60 families. That is not a rhetorical trick, it is just true. Real people in a real town would have lost real jobs because one old man would not soften 2 paragraphs. So tell me, honestly, in the comments, what is your no worth? Not in principle, in dollars. What is the actual number at which you would have found a way to be reasonable? And if you're sure there isn't one, then tell me what percentage of your income comes from the person who's going to ask you. They didn't fire me for being wrong. They fired me for being expensive. And the only reason I'm the one telling the story instead of a man in a hardware store apron is that 37 years ago I put a sign-in sheet in a drawer, and I have never, not once, been able to afford to forget it.